Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello. Usually, you guys are quiet earlier. So we didn't get to send around an email to all of you, but I'm curious. Some of you, I suspect, work for some of these NGOs, for international or national human rights organizations. Is that right? Or have worked for them? So can you let me know who? Yeah. Okay, we'll talk about Amnesty today. Yeah. Sorry? World Vision. Good. You want to say something about World Vision? What does World Vision do?
They do all sorts of stuff. They have
What did you do? I should maybe ask you.
I worked in the enterprise risk management.
You worked in what?
The risk management department at the Global Center, and trying to just identify the risks that they have with having different offices around the world and threats.
So worked in the risk management part of this large international organization, which just tells you that these are organizations that do the kind of things that have to deal in the world as other organizations deal. Any other things you worked for? Well, if you want to speak about that, I'd appreciate your views, because today's lecture is about, as you see, the history and practice of human rights, and of course, the specific lecture is on the rise of the NGO and the making of human rights culture. So I'm going to go through a kind of, it's been sort of a funnel. I'm going to start with a very general review of where we were last time with the Universal Declaration and the ancillary documents. And then I want to talk about the background, the deeper background and the specific background of some major NGOs, non-government organizations. And then I want to look specifically at sort of a life built around these organizations, as I say, the life of Jerry Leiber, which you read. Right? So my idea is my idea in the lecture and having you read Leiber is to have Leiber represent in one person's life, something of the history of the making and thickening of this world human rights culture. And then and I'm not going to be very critical about what I'll be talking about, but we will become more critical and more specifically engaged as we go on. But in general, then, it's the making of this particular world of human rights activism, which you all know well, and which you're very familiar with. But when I was your age, scarcely existed, and would have been known only to a very few number of people who were specially interested in this. There were no courses like this. There were no general books on this subject. So that's my aim for the day. So let me just give you a brief review and putting today's lecture in the context of previous lectures by telling you about the following. So I want to remind you of the Universal Declaration in 1948 and the view of one of its main authors, the French jurist René Cassin, who saw this document as the portico of a temple with these four large pillars of dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, each of which are then exemplified in one of the sets of articles that make up the Declaration. So what you no doubt already recognize, this is basically the French revolutionary ideals in its social and its political guises on an international stage. And remember, we then talked about two parts of this. There's a civil and political rights part, which were the first set of 20 or so aspects of this, which dealt with individual freedoms from and freedoms to act in civil society, freedom of speech, expression, religion, assembly, movement and so forth, and rights of political engagement, voting, and so forth. Then there was a whole second section, which was economic and social rights. So in a way, this document that we're talking about married 19th century liberal notions and 19th century socialist notions in one document. But it put them, I want to suggest, in a particular Cold War and post-colonial context. The post-colonial context is added by that part of the Universal Declaration which says that nations have the right to self-determination, which is basically its anti-colonial phrase. So we have political rights and civil rights, we have social and economic rights, and then we have this new right that didn't exist in the French Revolution because colonialism was in its infancy of that, which becomes so politically exigent in the 19th century. Now, those two sets of rights, the social and economic on the one hand, the political and the civil on the other, map on in some way to a point we've been talking about on and off in the course a bunch of times, which is the question of who bears rights. And here you have sort of two versions expressed in this document. On the one hand, the view of Charles Malik, whom I spoke to you about last time, who is a Western-trained Lebanese Christian philosopher, who was one of the major authors. And his view was who bears rights is the individual, the human person in his individuality and ultimately inviolability. This sort of a radically liberal humanist account of what counts as human rights. At the far other extreme was the Soviet bloc member of the committee who argued that the psychology of individualism has been used by the ruling class in most countries to preserve its freedom. Freedom is the perfect unity of individual and community. Or if you were to put this slightly less unfriendly way, freedom is this version that I spoke about last time, in which, and I quoted Engels' view, in which we don't need human rights anymore because the interests of the individual and the interests of the community are one in this after the revolution and the fulfilling of the revolution. So here are two sort of very different views, and as you know, most of the Eastern Bloc countries abstained from the Universal Declaration, along with voting for it, along with South Africa and Saudi Arabia, for reasons having to do with race and religion, respectively, in these countries. Okay, so we have then the individual and the social in this radical version, and these then get re-represented in these two documents that we talked about in 1966, which basically restate the two parts of the Declaration in separate documents, and are together understood as we said about the International Bill of Rights. Now, onto the social in these two parts, of which we see radical ideological, theoretical cause for it. We have also a historical basis that we've talked about before. We now add on this an anti-colonial and Cold War context. So we read, as you might recall, Fanon, who has little good to say for the notion of individual rights, which he sees as an ideology of the colonial power. But we also saw other colonial voices when we talk about the Badung Conference, who held the opposite view. So we have part of this version, part of this view of rights, then it's split by your view of the nature of colonialism. You map onto this then the Cold War context of the socialist East, U.S. West, and their allies, and they then fought out their rivalries in the third and developing world, in which the Soviet Union tended to claim we're supporting anti-colonialism, which means we're generally opposing the West's view of individual human rights, which also then maps onto what had been their principal position on socialist versions of human rights back in 1948. So we have these two axes then. We have human rights as in some sense held hostage to a US, USSR, and its allies' rivalry, which in turn maps onto a colonial, anti-colonial structure in which the West is associated with colonialism and the Soviet Union not. Now, in a sense, that's a very odd notion because the Soviet Union had a very large empire. But that structure was really dominant in the development of human rights. Now, more recently, when that's given way, the debates about human rights, the social and the individual, have mapped out onto issues about globalization. So as you'll see, at the end of the term, we'll talk about, is there an Asian version of human rights? And some Asian scholars and some Asian countries have argued that human rights standards as they're being applied now don't meet this particular Asian version of human rights. And I think that we can show maps on, not in the context of colonialism so much, but of a kind of globalization and a resistance to globalization. We'll talk more about that later. But for now, what I want you to see is that instead of historical developments that we talked about earlier, and instead of theoretical developments we talked about, and mapping, though, in some perfectly important way onto political developments. Now, we're on two tracks, the social and the economic and the political and the civic. We're on the East and West. We're on the colonial and not colonial. So you have to sort of keep all these things, in mind. And I just want to show you that, and we'll talk about this more when we have John Connolly talking about the rise of dissent culture in Eastern Europe. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in this lecture today. Europe really was divided politically and was understood to be divided in the rest of the world by these great alliance systems. And much of the world organized itself around this. One was allies of this side or that side, or one was explicitly non-aligned. The Badung Conference was part of a non-alignment movement. So this split of Europe, which by the time most of you were born, was gone, was hugely important in this period we're talking about, from the 1940s to the early 1990s. And I just want to, we'll come back to this map, but I need you to keep this sort of map in mind. It's projected not just in Europe, but into the world as a whole. And this sort of a French cartoon that makes this clear. I mean, in some sense, Stalin and Uncle Sam courting this person in between. So beneath a great deal of this talk is that kind of a version. Neither of these guys come to this table with clean hands in the human rights agenda, and the very different views all through Europe and the other parts of what these represent. So, from the point of view of the Soviet Union and some of its allies in the East, for example, the Soviet Union was the army of peace in the East. The enemies were the fascist West, the fascists, which had been supported by, until too late, by Western powers. So I'm just trying to explain to you, or how powerfully this East-West split looms over all this, looms over all this. And we'll fill this in as we go on. So that's the overall context. Now let's look at what NGOs are. Well, I think at tea yesterday we talked a little about what NGOs were, and someone, I think it was Catherine, said we were talking about these national organizations count as NGOs. And the answer is, the definition is so vague that it's hard to know whether something counts as an NGO or doesn't count as an NGO. But there's no question that these non-governmental organizations are important, and the political scientists and activists and also and international bodies are thinking about what they are. Let me just give you some other definitions before I give you mine. So the UN first started using the word very early on, basically in 1946, practically at the beginning. It enters the language of the Economic and Social Council in 1950. An NGO